All right, let's dive into something that might just change how you look at money, forever. We're digging into the work of Michael Hoffman, an independent scholar and a former Associated Press reporter. His book, Usury and Christendom, tells a pretty wild story, how charging interest on a loan went from being a mortal sin for over 1,500 years to becoming the very foundation of our modern global economy. This one really challenges some of our most basic assumptions. Let's get into it.
To really get a feel for how seriously this was taken, we got to go way back to the ancient world. When the Roman statesman Cicero was asked about usury, his answer was, well, it was chilling. He didn't just say it was bad, he literally put it on the same level as murder. And this wasn't some crazy out there opinion. This was a core moral belief that would shape Western civilization for centuries to come.
So let's get right to the heart of Hoffman's research. For a millennium and a half, charging interest wasn't just frowned upon. It wasn't just bad business. In the eyes of the church, it was a mortal sin. You know, the kind of sin that could put your eternal soul on the line. Now, this is a super important point that Hoffman makes, so we got to be clear. When you and I hear the word usury today, we think of loan sharks. We think of insane, sky-high interest rates. But that's not the historical definition. Back then, usury meant charging any interest, period. A 1% loan was just as sinful as a 100% loan. The act itself was seen as a form of theft.
So, why was it considered theft? What was the logic behind it? This quote from a 5th century sermon nails it. Think about it. A farmer sells wheat he grew. A craftsman sells a chair he made. But a usurer? A usurer in this view sells something he never owned in the first place, time, or the use of money. These were seen as gifts from God, things that belong to everyone. Making money from money was seen as, well, unnatural, like an offense against creation itself.
And believe me, the church was not messing around with this. The punishments for usury were incredibly severe. We're not talking about a little slap on the wrist. You could be excommunicated, basically kicked out of society. You could be denied communion, and maybe worst of all, you could be refused a Christian burial. In a world where your eternal salvation was everything, these were terrifying consequences. This was a moral law with serious teeth.
Okay, so if charging interest was this huge no-no, what did society even look like? It's a fascinating question, right? Hoffman's book tries to answer that, and it paints a picture of a world he calls Merry England, a place that ran on a completely different economic operating system.
14 weeks. Just let that number sink in for a second. Hoffman cites research from an Oxford professor, Thorold Rogers, who claimed that an average medieval laborer could earn enough in just 14 weeks of work to feed and house his family for an entire year. The rest of the year, it was for rest, for festivals, for community. It's a pretty stunning claim.
And this slide just lays out the contrast in black and white, doesn't it? On one side, you have the world Hoffman describes, people owning their property outright with plenty of food and good clothing. On the other side, well, it's our world. A world of trillion-dollar student debt and payday loans that can trap people in cycles of poverty. The book argues this was a fundamental change, from a world of owners to a world of debtors.
So what kept people from falling into these endless debt traps? According to the book, a big part of it was this idea from the Bible called the Jubilee. It was basically a giant, society-wide reset button. Every 7 years, debts were forgiven. And then, in the 50th year, the big one, the Jubilee, everything was wiped clean. Debts vanished, and land went back to its original family owners. It was a system designed to stop wealth from getting concentrated in just a few hands. And get this, that famous line on the Liberty Bell, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land." That's a direct quote from the part of the Bible that talks about the Jubilee.
So, the big question is, if this was the rule for 1,500 years, how on earth did we get from there to here? How did a mortal sin turn into standard business practice? This next part is all about what Hoffman calls the Great Reversal, the specific moments that flipped the world of finance on its head.
Hoffman argues this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual process, a chipping away at the old moral code. He points to guys like the theologian John Eck, who started arguing for exceptions, supposedly with a little financial encouragement from a massive banking family. Then you have reformers like John Calvin, who brought in this idea of situation ethics, basically saying the old rules don't always apply. And finally, thinkers like John Locke came along and completely reframed it. Usury wasn't a sin anymore. It was an economic right, a part of the freedom of commerce.
And this is a perfect example of the kind of clever legal gymnastics people use to get around the ban. It's called the triple contract.
It was a genius loophole, really. Instead of one illegal loan with interest, you'd write up 3 separate contracts that were, on their own, perfectly legal. You'd form a partnership, then get insurance on your investment, and then sell your future profits for a guaranteed return. The result? Exactly the same as a loan with interest, but now it was hidden behind a bunch of legal jargon.
So what's the end result of all this? In this last section, we're going to look at what Hoffman sees as the final consequence of this great reversal. A world where the old sin of usury isn't just okay, it's actually celebrated.
Hoffman throws this really jarring quote out there from the famous economist Ludwig von Mises. Now, in Hoffman's analysis, von Mises is basically saying that Jesus' teachings aren't spiritual wisdom, but a dangerous ideology that stirs up hatred of the rich. Hoffman presents this as a total 180 from traditional Christian values, which always emphasized protecting the poor. And according to Hoffman, this is where that logic ultimately leads you, to the philosophy of Ayn Rand. In her world, as Hoffman interprets it, there's no such thing as a right to a home or a fair wage. The only right that matters is the right to make a deal. He argues this is where Christian charity gets completely replaced by what he calls naked self-interest, where every human interaction is just a transaction.
And here's where Hoffman makes his most provocative point. He argues that systems that we see as total opposites, like communism and the kind of radical capitalism Ayn Rand championed, are actually 2 sides of the same coin. Why? Because from his perspective, they're both totally materialistic. They both throw out that old spiritual and moral framework. In both systems, he claims, the chase for material stuff, whether by the state or by the individual, becomes more important than anything else.
So in the end, Michael Hoffman's book isn't just history. It's a fundamental challenge to the way our world works. By digging up this forgotten past, it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. What if the very engine of our modern economy, the idea of profit itself, is built on something that for more than 1,000 years our ancestors called a mortal sin? What if it's built on what they called theft? It's a heavy thought, and once you start thinking about it, it's pretty hard to stop.